It's my privilege to welcome Professor Mrinalini Sinha of the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor today. Mrinalini is going to be speaking on the political in question, rethinking India's 20th century. Over to you, Mrinalini.
Thank you, Professor Malhotra, for that very gracious and generous introduction. My talk this afternoon is about the movement for the abolition of indenture. The two broad questions that I'm going to be addressing in my talk on the abolition of indenture. One is to try and figure out why this has been absent in our historiography, both in a national and now in a global and transnational historiography. The movement for the abolition of indenture has been signally absent. And I want to try and think about this movement to open up two questions. One about the 20th century, India's 20th century. And of course, there's been lots of very interesting work on the 20th century in India, how we periodize the 20th century. In particular, we've had lots of very interesting work on that middle point of the 20th century, the independence divide, and a lot of very interesting scholarship trying to work across that 1947 midpoint and across the independence divide. And I think there's another very interesting body of work on the end point of the 20th century. Then when does the 20th century end? And we get that in thinking about the 1970s and the emergency and the changes that happen. Others look to the 80s or the 90s when we actually get the beginnings, of the official beginnings at least, of economic liberalization. But in thinking of the periodization of the 20th century this way, I think the early point, the beginning point, does get neglected. And I want to see how placing abolition of indenture in that story might give us a different periodization or a different trajectory of the 20th century, focusing on when does the 20th century actually begin. So that's one big question that I want to address. The second kind of question that I think I would want to address with the abolition movement is to think about the place of political history, about what is political, at a time when, in some sense, we've had a proliferation of work on the history of politics, that everything in a way is political. There's power relations in everything. Everything is political. So what is the role in this kind of larger understanding of politics, from the personal is political to, high politics? What is the place of political history in this particular moment? So those are the two questions that I want to think about in talking about the indenture. So my talk this afternoon focuses on the popular movement in India for the abolition of the indentured labor system. Between 1834, in the aftermath of the abolition of Atlantic slavery, and March 20th, 1917, when recruitment for indentured labor from India was ended, a very small fraction of the total number of workers exported from India under a variety of coercive conditions were transported under government-sanctioned indenture contracts with draconian penal provisions to substitute for emancipated Africans as cheap labor on plantations across the British Empire and beyond. This second abolition, so named in the wake of the prior abolition of Atlantic slavery, is largely forgotten today in both popular memory and in contemporary historiography. Once, for example, January 1st, the day in 1920 when the last of the existing indenture contracts were abrogated, was celebrated as the Day of Deliverance, on par with Emancipation Day, August 1st, that commemorated the ending of Atlantic slavery on some of the Caribbean islands. But the Day of Deliverance has long since been replaced by celebrations of various days of arrival, the date on which the first shiploads of indentured workers from India arrived in the various colonies. This reversal, I suggest, is a symptom precisely of the shrinking of the field of the political after the empire-wide abolition of Indian indenture and the post-World War remaking of an international order in favor of nation-states. My talk will make three arguments about the nature of the contribution of the anti-indenture movement. First, it constituted a new political subject, the people or the demos in the political landscape of India. Second, the claims of this movement were not particularistic, but framed in universalist terms as incarnating the totality of society. And third, it produced a conception of the common or the community as a whole that was antagonistic to other rival conceptions of the common. My larger point is that reckoning with the nature of this neglected movement calls for nothing less than a reconsideration of the political as such, and more specifically of that axial event of the 20th century, namely decolonization. I will conclude by reflecting on some implications of my project for a renewal of the field of political history in the wake of the turn to the histories of politics, and for revitalizing the analytics of the global and the post-national that are currently becoming de rigueur in South Asian historiography. Let me begin with a story that became a cause célèbre of the anti-indenture movement in India. On May 8, 1913, the abolitionist newspaper, the Bharat Mitra, a leading Hindi-language daily published in Calcutta, carried a letter purportedly written by an obscure woman called Kunti. She was indeed identified in the press as a married woman belonging to the untouchable caste from Gorakhpur in the erstwhile United Provinces of Eastern India, the chief labor-exporting region under the indentured labor system. In her letter, Kunti recounts in harrowing detail her escape from a sexual assault by her white overseer on the Nausori plantation of the Australian colonial sugar refining company in the Fiji Islands, where she was indentured. While fending off the unwanted advances of Mr. Cobcroft, Kunti claims she managed to alert Bhagwa, another indentured worker who happened to be cutting grass nearby. Making the most of this temporary distraction, Kunti escaped from the clutches of Cobcroft and ran towards the Wanibukasi River. With Cobcroft still on her heels, she was forced to jump into the river to save herself. Fortunately for Kunti, there were two other indentured workers, Sugini and her son Jagdeo, whose dinghy happened to be close by and who rescued her from the water. Now, the story of Kunti's resilience, or if you will, of her good fortune, became available for multiple appropriations in India within very diverse narratives. It was duly picked up by all the major pro-abolition English and Indian language newspapers of the time. Versions of the story also entered the broader popular culture through numerous vernacular poems, tracts, plays, folk songs, and public performances, especially in the migration-inspired folk genre of Eastern India called the Bidesiya, literally meaning the foreigner, in the years leading up to abolition. The popularity of Kunti's story notwithstanding, its significance and that of the movement for which it became a symbol remains only scarcely understood. At stake precisely is the place of Kunti's story, and by extension of Indian abolitionism, in inaugurating a new era of popular anti-colonial politics in India. It is a truth almost universally acknowledged that the advent of mass anti-colonial politics in India occurred only after the arrival of M.K. Gandhi to India from South Africa in 1915, when he succeeded in incorporating the masses into what until now was a largely elite nationalist movement. The relationship of Indian abolitionism to this dominant narrative of nationalist politics in India may best be characterized in terms of what could be called a mésentente, to be translated not merely as misrecognition, even though Indian abolitionism has certainly suffered its share of misrecognition, but more crucially as the inaudibility that comes out of talking past one another. The scholarship indeed has followed suit. Too often, for example, scholars identify the entire anti-indenture movement only with what the colonial bureaucracy insisted was the sentimental objections of a small elite nationalist leadership in India. The indenture system in this elite Indian discourse was an affront to the nation's honor. It was held responsible for the fact that all Indians, and not just the class of Indians from which the indentured workers came, were stigmatized abroad as coolies and thus subject to racist discrimination. Even when the more popular dimension of the movement is acknowledged, it is too often folded into the narrative of an exclusively Gandhian politics, in which it appears merely as an extension of the South African phase of his movement, most notably of his last mass civil disobedience or satyagraha in South Africa in 1913, and the first to involve indentured workers. Scholars have thus largely followed Gandhi's own writing, who in his book Satyagraha in South Africa alludes only briefly to the broader anti-indenture movement in India, and then only as an early intimation of the potential of transplanting onto Indian soil his novel weapon of Satyagraha. Indian abolitionism has thus remained largely misrecognized in the historiography of India's 20th century. Temporalized as politically backwards, identified with an elite nationalist politics superseded by the advent of Gandhian mass nationalist politics, and located spatially as external, as having to do more with the diasporic politics of South Africa and the colonies than with that of India proper. This misrecognition itself, however, is not a neutral one. The inaudibility of popular abolitionism in histories of India's 20th century functions precisely to deny the subjects whose voices were mobilized during the movement their status as political subjects, that is, as subjects produced out of the working of politics rather than as subjects belonging to already given or pre-existing identity categories and social groups in India. This is what is disavowed when Indian abolitionism is excised from its legitimate place as an inaugural moment of popular all-India anti-colonial politics. The iconic story of Kunti is exemplary in pointing towards what I am calling the three novel contributions of the pro-abolition movement in India. These include, once again, first, the constitution of a new type of political subject, a part of those who have no part during the mobilization against indenture. Second, the assertion of this part of no part, and here I'm quoting Rancière, in such a way so as to form an identification with the community as a whole. So the idea that this particular group identified with a universal claim rather than just with their own demands. And finally, the antagonistic relationship of its competing representation of the common to other rival representations. Consider first the nature of the political subject, the demos or the people, constituted by the anti-indenture movement. While the unanimity of public opinion on abolition in all the major political parties and established factions in India, from the Indian National Congress to the Muslim League, the Home Rulers to the non-Brahmin movement, the moderates to the extremists, and the traditional political classes to the emerging class of big industrialists and capitalists, was certainly unprecedented. It was really the popular mobilization of hitherto obscure men and women, those who had no part in national deliberations, that gave abolitionism in India its political novelty. The official investigations into Kunti's story reveal something about the concerted efforts and the network of indentured and ex-indentured or time-expired workers who tried to insert themselves into the national debate on indenture in India. The government of India, nervous of the potential of a public relations disaster around Kunti's story, issued a secret directive to the government of Fiji to investigate the case of Kunti so as to establish, as Aryan Thovan, Secretary of the Government of India, wrote, the falsity of the case before it had a chance to cause more damage in India. The Fiji government's investigations, in an effort to discredit the story, succeeded in getting recantations from Bhagwa, Sugani, and Jagdeo, who were named by Kunti as agents in her escape, but it failed to deter Kunti from the facts narrated in her letter. She insisted that what she had claimed to have happened actually did happen. The Fiji government responded by casting aspersions on Kunti's character on the basis of testimony provided by the accused, Copcraft, and a newly hired overseer on the plantation. In a sworn affidavit, they both claimed that Kunti was a recalcitrant worker and a woman of questionable character. With the connivance of her husband, himself an ex-felon, she had allegedly had an affair with the former Indian Sardar or overseer on the plantation, who in exchange routinely gave the couple the easiest work on the plantation. On Singh's dismissal, and this is the Fiji government's account, on Singh's dismissal by the plantation manager, and with the arrival of a new overseer, Ram Harak, who refused Kunti's favors, she had allegedly fabricated the story against the plantation manager, Copcraft, to retaliate against the dismissal of her lover. The investigation summarily concluded then, and I quote, that it was absolutely untrue that any female indentured immigrant are ever violated or receive hurt or cruel treatment at the hand of their plantation managers, end of quote. It further noted that two known political agitators in the islands, the ex-indentured worker Totaram Sanadhya and a recently arrived Arya Samajist missionary from India, had orchestrated Kunti's letter to the press in India. Now, even though the Indian government decided, rather wisely I think, not to publish the findings of the secret inquiry into Kunti's story, and the archives themselves are completely silent on whether Kunti was really sexually assaulted at the Nassori plantation or whether she had just simply concocted the story either to avenge the dismissal of her lover or to further the cause of abolition. Kunti's story was the tip of the iceberg of an extensive propaganda war waged by an army of anti-indenture activists spanning India and the colonies, especially Fiji, the last of the colonies to start recruiting indentured workers from India, and the only one still substantially dependent on a continued supply of labor from India, to transform the debate on indenture so that it centered squarely on indentured workers themselves. In other words, they sought to secure equal recognition for the victims of the indentured system itself as those of the victims of a general white racism abroad that had been a subject of nationalist concern in India and a catalyst for nationalist attention to the problem of indenture until now. The popular anti-indenture movement made the class from which indentured workers were recruited hitherto either only objects of disdain or of humanitarian concern and protection, partners in the public debate over indenture. Sanadhya, the ex-indentured worker and abolitionist, was identified both in the Fiji government investigations and in a public testimonial given to him by workers in Fiji on his departure for India as the person who was responsible for smuggling out publications, including Kunti's letter, from Fiji to the press in India. On his return to India, Sanadhya published My 21 Years in Fiji, the closest thing produced by the Second Abolition to the slave narratives made famous during the movement for the abolition of Atlantic slavery. And this book reproduced Kunti's story along with other stories of men and women in Fiji whose kashт or hardship he had seen firsthand. The association of indentured workers with the national debate. Sanadhya, for example, was the first peasant to address the annual conference of the Indian National Congress in Madras in December 1914, and Kunti, on her return to India, shared a platform with Bhupendranath Basu, a member of the Imperial Legislative Assembly, at a large public meeting against indenture in Calcutta in August 1913, did not go unrewarded. It prompted this movement and this involvement of indentured and ex-indentured workers themselves, prompted the famous 1916 report on indentured labor in Fiji by Reverend C.F. Andrews and W.W. Pearson that is credited with having single-handedly converted the Viceroy and his government to abolition. The report was something of a landmark in being the first ever inquiry into the indenture system that relied on the testimony of indentured workers themselves. And one could see the genealogy here of a series of people's reports that would emerge throughout the independence struggle after this time, after this initial report. The contours of the public debate on indenture within a relatively short period had been considerably expanded. But the political subjectivization of the anti-indenture movement was not confined to the class from which indentured workers were recruited, nor, for that matter, to any pre-given or already existing part or well-defined group in society. By the 1910s, indeed, only a very small proportion of the population in India, no more than 3,000 to 4,000 annually, was still being recruited on indentured labor contracts overseas. And a very localized area, only 2 districts in the United Provinces, for example, provided more than 80% of annual recruitment, were directly affected by the indentured labor trade. Those newly politicized by Kunti's story and who came to constitute an expanded public opinion on indenture had little in common except for the fact of their prior exclusion from public debate. The example of the Marwaris of Calcutta, an immigrant community of Hindu and Jain businessmen from Western India, with a reputation for being conservative, and this was a contemporary reputation, for being conservative and clannish or aloof, is especially apposite here. Calcutta Marwari organizations provided the bulk of the funds as well as the infrastructure and activists for the village-level anti-indenture movement in eastern India. And this despite the fact that Marwaris were generally not among the indentured recruits for plantations overseas. It was the Marwari paper Bharat Mitra, whose circulation extended to the Indian communities in Fiji, that first published Kunti's letter, and it was the Marwari Relief Society of Calcutta that set up anti-indenture leagues and coolie protection societies in Calcutta, Madras, Bombay, and small towns and villages across northern India to coordinate the nationwide protest against indenture. Conveniently located in the port city from where all the ships departed and returned with indentured workers to and from the colonies, and where the holding depots of the colonial governments were located that collected and quarantined recruits from the north before their embarkation to the colonies, the Calcutta Marwaris were well placed to play such a pivotal role in the anti-indenture movement. Already by switching from the Mudiya script to Hindi, written in the Devanagari script, albeit a Khariboli or rustic Hindi, instead of the Sanskritized Hindi of the heartland of the Hindi movement in northern India, the Calcutta Marwaris had begun to shed some of the parochialism long associated with this diasporic community in Bengal. But abolition as a public cause that went beyond the welfare of the Marwari community itself and brought the community in touch with a largely until now neglected constituency in the villages and small towns of northern India, was the perfect vehicle for providing the Marwaris with a broader identification to mark their debut in the arena of national politics. Likewise, in another first, a delegation of elite and middle-class Hindu and Muslim women from different British Indian provinces appeared before the Viceroy in Delhi with a petition in favor of abolition. With abolition, they were staking a claim for organized women to contribute to a debate on an issue of general public interest in which they were not expected to have a voice. The true stakes of abolition, given the actual numbers in India directly affected by the indentured system then, was never just the explicit demand, that is, the abolition of indenture, but also the very right to be heard and to be recognized as an equal partner in the public.